All right. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening to everybody who is joining us. I am your host today. My name is Matt Kelly. Some of you may know me as the editor of Radical Compliance, a weekly newsletter, and I am here today to pinch hit for EQS on this webinar that we are having. Marco Goldberg, the original moderator, he fell sick, so I am happy to be here. Happy to have you all joining us for this session on speak up cultures in global organizations, how you're going to cultivate them, how to mitigate and overcome employee unease about speaking up. And we have some great panelists who are going to talk with us for the next hour on that issue. Broadly speaking, I'll get to our three panelists in a moment, but broadly speaking, we want to hit on a couple of basic points today. Why a strong speak up culture is important and what defines a strong speak up culture. How do you know that you have one? How can you recognize it? What are the effective strategies and efforts that you can put in place to encourage that speak up culture? Of course, how to talk about employee fears of retaliation, how to overcome retaliation, how to work with other managers in your organization to build an anti-retaliation culture. And then lastly, how you would actually measure your speak up culture so that you can document it, assess the effectiveness of your culture. Sooner or later, if you have an incident of some kind, regulators might ask about what your workplace culture is, and having that documentation and those assessments is probably going to be very useful. So how would you look at that? We're going to cover all of those kind of issues, and whatever else might come to mind for attendees. Certainly we want to have a lot of questions, but to help me through this conversation, I have three panelists I'm going to introduce now. First is Bill Burtis. He is the Chief Compliance Officer and Deputy General Counsel at Juniper Networks. Bill, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Also is Ashley Dubrini. She is the Ethics and Compliance Director at the Nature Conservancy for North America and Micronesia, I believe. Ashley, glad to have you here too.
Thank you, Matt.
And then last but not least, we have Penny Milner-Smith. She is the director at Ethical Ways, which is a consulting firm that works on workplace integrity issues. And Penny is joining us all the way from South Africa. So Penny, good evening, I think. I believe it's nighttime there, but we're glad to have you here too.
You are quite right, Matt. It's a chilly winter evening here in Durban, South Africa.
Oh, my goodness. Well, it is 100 hot degrees where I am in North America, but compliance is a worldwide phenomenon. So,
Indeed.
As I said moments ago, for everybody who is listening, we do want to hear your questions and comments. If you have any questions you'd like to make or just observations, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function. I believe that you have a box on your view screens there where you can submit a question. We will set aside probably the last 10 minutes or so for audience questions, unless you ask a particularly good one, in which case I will try to get to the question right away. Or even if you just have comments you want to make, feel free to do that as well, and we'll try and read them out. We are doing this for the benefit of the listeners, so the more interactive and responsive we can make it with the audience, the better off it will be for all of us, and we're happy to do it. So that's all of my opening remarks. With that, I wanted to pose a kickoff question to all of the speakers we have here. Basically, why there is such an important focus on having a speak up culture, because compliance and ethics officers have a lot to do. There are an awful lot of demands on your time with an awful lot of different parts of the enterprise. So what makes having a speak up culture such an important objective that it really should be one of the paramount concerns for the compliance program? Bill, I'll start with you, and then maybe Ashley and Penny. What's your take on that question?
Well, I think first off, I think having a strong speak up culture, quite frankly, can make your job a little bit easier in many ways. So I think when we talk about competing interest and priorities, what I've noticed over time is ethics and compliance programs are now really investing up front with capital and time and energy and efforts to really see what I've been hearing now coined often is this return on integrity, or the ROI of our programs. And so I really, really think that speak up cultures do really three things for us. They've always helped us really enhance kind of early detection of issues and help us get ahead of the escalations and remediate. But they also, one thing I've learned over the last 4 years here at Juniper as the CCO is that they really are about attracting and retaining a workforce of really more inclusive, engaged workforce. And I think that's something I didn't appreciate before when we talk about the why of a speak up culture. And then the last piece, because I'm a tech company, we really, it's all about improving innovation and effectiveness, because what we really want to do is have those open dialogues around speak up. And we want people to challenge things, experiment, take risk, believe that or not. We want people to take risks. We want them to fail and fail fast and then learn from those lessons, all within the appropriate guardrails. And so I think for us, it's really important that we have the kind of speak up culture so we can really capitalize on building a better business and a better workforce and really mitigate risk, which is our primary task from my side.
All right. Ashley, what would you say?
I like what Bill mentioned about competing with all the other things that we're doing in our organizations. And like many nonprofits, we aren't highly regulated. And on top of that, we have staff who are focused each day on saving the last great places and tackling climate. And there's certainly a challenge in raising the significance of speak up culture when the day-to-day work feels urgent and of lasting global consequence. And just like any organization, we too thrive in a safe and a respectful workplace. So our compliance team draws from the values that we share with our colleagues around respect for people and communities, integrity, tangible, lasting results, to convey that speak up doesn't create barriers to work, but rather it creates pathways for a healthy culture, a healthy workforce, and ultimately, to us, it upholds our mission. For some folks, that's the bottom line. For nonprofits, it might be being able to meet our goals and achieve our mission. So that's a lot of why it's important to us in the message that we're creating as a compliance team, is the pathways that it creates to meeting that mission.
All right. And then Penny, give me your thoughts, but I also wanted to see if maybe you could talk a little bit about something that Bill had said, that they're a tech company, and tech companies work by trying new things. And so part of being able to speak up is that I think this is a good tech idea. Maybe this isn't a good tech idea. Like, there is a connection between a strong speak up culture for ethics and just a strong speak up culture for business performance, to find the best idea, because technology is a very competitive sector. I thought that was an excellent point of Bill's. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, a little bit about what else you've seen with clients you've worked with, about why getting a speak up culture strong and healthy and right is so important.
I think most people on the call, Matt, understand the regulatory pressures that make a speak up culture really important. We want to be the first to know. Amongst many of my clients across different sectors, different jurisdictions, when I have an opportunity to speak to the CEO and say, what keeps you up at night? So often I hear that it is the fear that they will wake up in the morning and find in the public domain information that brings their organization into disrepute that they didn't know about. And this is a very powerful driver of acquiring senior level energy for the concept of a speak up culture. But the point that it is essential for performance really is where we need to reach line managers, even at the lowest levels of team leaders and first line supervisors. If people are unable to express their views, to venture a critique of the status quo in the form of suggesting an improvement, there's no possibility of innovation. And while there's so many initiatives going on in an organization at any one point in time, I really think that creating a speak up culture is the ultimate win-win. That is, you achieve engagement. In the process, you typically achieve ethical conduct, but you achieve continuous improvement and you achieve innovation. And in turn, you deliver the sustainability of the business.
You know, I often think about companies that have high levels of internal reporting. And I know that at first glance, that might lead somebody to think, well, clearly then your company is a mess because everybody is speaking up about all sorts of problems. But actually, I view it more as a metric of how eager your workforce is to address problems and try to solve them. And if you boiled this down to the example just of a family where your spouse might have stresses at work, or your child is being bullied at school, or the other child has addiction problems, but nobody talks about it, does that sound like a family that is healthy, that you'd want to be a part of? That, you know, can you imagine them sitting down for family dinner and nobody is talking about the elephants in the room? And I think if you frame it that way, everybody would say, of course, that's a terrible idea. But that is what a stifling culture of retaliation, that's what it is at the corporate level. Like, Bill, you know, since you brought up that good point about this being a tech company and you guys think about it, maybe could you talk to that a little bit more, just about how this really is how a company is, how willing is it to talk about things that aren't working or things that might work better? Sometimes it's ethics, sometimes it's tech or product development. I don't know. But like, you know, do you frame it that way or talk about it that way with senior managers?
So I think originally we didn't frame it this way. I think over time we've kind of moved or orientated ourselves towards this innovation component because it actually speaks across the entire employee population. Quite frankly, you're trying to find something that resonates across everyone. And one of the things we do early on at the company is I actually meet with all the new employees with the company, all collectively, not one by one, but collectively, because we got 11,000 plus employees here at Juniper. And so what we talk to them, not about policies, not about rules, we talk to them about situations. And we talk to them about building trust through strong speak up cultures and the implications from a financial perspective, from an innovation perspective, and from a compliance perspective. But often that last piece is the gimme. Everyone understands that we need to speak up, raise your hand when you see something, say something kind of components. But I think what we really generated is this dialogue about what is expected when you come on board here at the company. And I'm always amazed because I think the employees, one, appreciate the conversation. I think it's one of those activities that we do that, quite frankly, is probably different from a lot of places because that's not what they're expecting. They're expecting training. They're expecting the rules and the policies for you to break down each one for them so they don't violate those. And instead, we talk about, well, here's the compliance organization that's here to help you and support you and build this kind of trust level that you can leverage. And I think most importantly for the employees, I think it's you remind them that this isn't just some amorphous entity that you're joining. Like you are actually responsible for building the culture, whether it's a speak up culture or just a culture in general. You are literally at the cornerstone of making this happen. You get the unique responsibility to create this culture, to share it, to make sure it's being held accountable. And that's not something you should rely on other people to do. And I think that messaging has really worked and resonated with a lot of people because they come on board, they want that kind of culture. Then they know they're empowered to create that culture and hold it accountable. And then we follow up with the actions required in order to make sure that continues to elevate as we move forward. And I think that's been a new message that a lot of folks who we have had a chance to talk to. We talk about low trust environments, high trust environments. Which one do you want to work at? It's a pretty easy dichotomy of what you want to do. And a lot of people have had experience in low trust. And I think this is often the first time for them that they've been a chance to build and feel like they're in a high trust environment. And I think that's generate a lot more innovation and conversations. I mean, we have engineers here. All they're doing is coding and doing things that I can't do for sure. And they're building products and they need to know how that resonates for them. And I think they feel much more empowered as a result of those kind of initial conversations that we're having.
Let me shift questions a little bit here because, Bill, you also, I like the way that you framed it as, do they want to be part of a high trust environment or a low trust environment? And most employees would, quite naturally say, well, I want the high trust environment. But it gets to something that I have seen elsewhere in various studies of employee attitudes and whatnot, is that the vast majority of employees want to speak up. And they want to speak up about things that are not just malfunctioning in the job, but are ethically wrong. And they often will say that I do want to speak up. Well, why do you want to speak up? Because it's the right thing to do, and I want my company to succeed. And that is the sort of raw material or attitude that should have everybody on this webinar dancing for joy. That is exactly what you want an employee to say. But then, yeah, I've also seen these studies say in the next question, well, why don't you speak up? I don't feel anything will get done. I am afraid I will suffer retaliation. So that is a long-winded way of me getting to the next question I wanted to ask about the importance of creating a safe environment where employees can recognize this is a high trust world. I like this organization. I'm going to speak up. Now, that's what we want, but where do you start if you're a compliance officer to try to create that safe environment? Maybe Ashley, I'll ask you what you think, and then Penny, and then Bill. But how would you start to try to create that safe zone?
We actually think about it twofold. So the first step is that raising awareness, right? We call it demystifying at the Nature Conservancy, demystifying the reporting process. What happens if I speak up? There's often a lot of fear about that, right? When you go outside of your team or your business unit to talk to somebody. And we talk to folks a lot about organic solutions. We're very thoughtful in our communications, our timing. We try to minimize disruption. So that's part of it, is just raising awareness and making it more accessible. But the other part that I think is really important for the safety and the trust is working with leadership on how to hear concerns and how to handle them when people do raise something. Because it is often safer, or feels safer, to start local, start with someone you know, versus calling the helpline or the hotline, or reaching out to that person maybe in another state or even another country, right? So we spend a lot of time working with our local leaders on what does that look like to create a safe place, and recognizing it takes a lot of courage to raise a concern, to report something. And so helping them understand how to listen with care, how to listen without judgment, what are their resources, empowering them with resources, and of course, knowing when they need to call for help. So when do they need to involve us? When do they need to involve HR? So that's a big part of it that can be missed. We do all this. One of my partners said once, you all are on the mountaintop. You're really shouting this message all over the organization. But equal to that is making sure our leaders are ready to hear those concerns and know how to welcome them, to thank folks for having the courage and the trust in them up front to bring it forward, and to not do it alone, to bring in the compliance team, especially for those cases where they might not have the training on, okay, what do I do with this concern?
Sure. Penny, what would you say?
I think, building on Ashley, one of the things that I say when I'm working with various organizations that engage me to encourage their employees to speak up, is to say to the leaders who always tell me they have an open door policy. I have never worked with a client where the leadership team say we have a closed door policy. One such leader, I was running a group for a cross-functional team of what I call guardians, the finance, the HR, etc. teams. And this accounts clerk said, well, I actually see the CEO 3 times a day when I take authorizations to him to sign from the finance division. And I have been wanting to broach a tricky topic with him for 2 months. But in the last 2 months of seeing him 3 times per working day, he has never looked up at me. Mm-hmm. And so I have not taken the opportunity to speak. Now, I know in giving the feedback to the CEO, he felt absolutely devastated, but he was in a routine when the person came into the room of not breaking his focus, taking the documents, signing them, handing them back, and treating that person as if they were a robot. Mm-hmm. Big talk, for example, sharing that you suspect or have knowledge of wrongdoing comes from small talk. If you have no small talk in your business, you are not going to have big talk. And so we're really needing to help anyone who has influence, whether they are team leaders, first-line supervisors, guardians, to actually take the time to give people the impression that they're interested and that they're easy to talk to. So often a person says to a manager, I'd like to have a word with you. And the manager says, I'm rushing, let's walk and talk. Or the minute a meeting with the team is finished, they are, or before it's finished, they are packing up their goods and clearly rushing out. So just creating space of prioritizing the pause and actually attaching value to small talk rather than seeing it as wasting time is something that can help lead to big talk.
I love that small talk to big talk component. And honestly, I think when you break down everything we're doing as compliance officers and professionals out there, it's about creating relationships. You know, Matt, you talked about family early on. You know, I treat people around me as family, and I think we want to make sure people feel comfortable to have the tough conversations and the soft conversations. And we need to make sure they understand the difference, but also understand they can have those anytime they want. And I think one thing I would say around, you know, how do you create these environments? I mean, I think everyone's searching for something, and there's some baseline pieces, right? I mean, one thing for sure for me is that you have to be intentional. Like, you've really got to map this stuff out. This is not going to happen overnight. This is not going to happen by chance. And I think you've got to really dig in deep early and figure out, what does that mean? And even when you map it out, it's going to take time. And so one thing I've learned is that, you know, like, we're basically often doing branding of the organization, branding of what is the expectation for the companies. In many ways, I often characterize, my team hears me talk about it all the time, characterizing our organization as a marketing department for good. And we are often like really trying to figure out, how do we get that brand out there for people early and often? And that's why I talked about starting at the very beginning with employees. But Penny just mentioned, and Ashley mentioned, the leadership components and how that plays in. And so we actually spend a lot of time in the middle of management as well. So I think there are some tone at the top is your default, as you hear that all the time. It's you know, the corporatisms often you hear is you got to have strong tone at the top. But actually what we're finding is, practically speaking, it's the tone in the middle that actually drives the more behavior from what we're seeing on a practical side. And so we spend a lot of time meeting with new managers. We also have a very similar program, as I mentioned, for new employees, for new managers. If you're a new manager in 6 months, you get a leading with integrity component. And we prepare you and prep you for those difficult conversations and how to handle and listen and be a big part of that employee's experience in their work. They're looking for them for guidance, and that's why they're in those roles. And so we empower our managers. And the other thing I would just offer is that, you know, I think you talked about influencing, Penny. It's interesting. I didn't do it intentionally. I mean, we've never met actually prior to working on this panel and kind of prepping here, is that we've actually got a program here called Integrity Influencers. And it's literally designed for those mid-level managers, senior directors, mostly senior directors are in these roles, and they are in the field closest to the action. They are trusted individuals who have a long experience here inside the company, and who are their go-to counterparts before they even come to the ICG or Integrity and Compliance Group here at Juniper. So it's very common that employees will definitely reach out to those individuals first and have, you know, initial dialogues, and then there's a follow-up, and then there's connections across the entire organization. But I think that integrity influencers is something that I was thinking more YouTube influencing and all that good stuff. But I think it really works here, because I think we're trying to put people closest to the action and closest to the issues. And because I can't see everything at HQ, and I just a little background. Just I was based in Paris at a sales rep office for 4 years in one company, another company for another 4. And ultimately, it was that experience there that let me know that sometimes those HQ messages don't resonate in the field. And I was able to at least have those conversations early on, but it opened my eyes to kind of that breadth and scope that we have to work on as compliance professionals in order to resonate with the people that are not next to you all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's striking listening to all three of you that really what you're talking about to create these safe spaces are you work with the middle managers. Why? Because they are, and I think, Bill, you're the one who said this, they are one of the most trusted groups in the whole organization. Management trusts middle managers to do the function, and yet the rank and file employees trust the managers because I see this person every day. They are my boss, and they know what they're doing. And so that is where, if you want this culture to work, that's where you have to strike. In the interest of time, and to answer one of the questions there, somebody had asked, are there polling questions today? There are, and in fact, here is our first polling question for all of the attendees. What are the most common barriers preventing employees from speaking up about ethics and compliance concerns at your organization? And you have, I see, 5 different choices there. Lack of awareness of reporting channels, lack of trust in how the complaint will be handled, a culture discouraging dissent, fear of retaliation, and reports. I will be honest, I'm not sure what reports means, but take a look at those answers, those choices, and press the one that I believe these questions pop up on your individual screens. I see some answers coming in now. And we'll give it about 30 seconds or so. And then if we see the results, we can talk about them a bit. But, I am struck that I see, lack of awareness of available reporting channels. I get frustrated sometimes about companies that still struggle on that, which strikes me as a sort of basic block and tackle operation that you should have in place. Even if employees don't want to use it, even if your culture is terrible. But if you don't have the whistleblower hotline or you don't have some sort of mechanism to let employees do it, Penny, let me ask you, because you work with a lot of companies, do you see that organizations still struggle with something like a lack of a hotline or lack of telling employees there is a hotline, you can use it? I mean, are there companies out there that still struggle on that? I consider those very basic hurdles now, but is that still an issue?
You're right that they are basic hurdles. We're now in a position where many expert, independent, specialist hotline providers can make services like this available at a really low cost in terms of the value. One of the things that I think companies get wrong is that I hear from medium and small companies about the fact that their employee complement does not justify the expense in a hotline. Then I'll start saying to them, for example, so you're in financial services, what are your assets under management? Or I'll say, tell me about your stakeholders. What is the scope of your customer or supplier database? And they start talking to me about enormous numbers. And I'm saying, do you understand that small and medium businesses actually suffer worse from fraud events that they don't know about and that they tend to take longer to detect because of the lack of these systems? And they are more catastrophic. And it's not just your employee number. It really relates to the complexity of the parties who are stakeholders to your organization. And the fact that, as this old Japanese proverb goes, the reputation of 1,000 years can be destroyed by the actions of one person in 1 hour. I think we're still needing to get the message out there.
Well, Let me talk about now some of these results here. So now that we have them, thankfully, the lack of awareness issue did score fairly low, 6%.
Yeah,
But
very good.
okay, we still have the most common issues are lack of trust in what the company is going to do with my complaint or my report once I submit it, including fear of the company doing nothing. And remember what we had said before. I think it was Ethisphere had published a research report a couple of years ago. One of the biggest reasons that employees want to report is they want companies to do better. But one of the reasons they don't actually report is they think nobody's going to listen to me. So they're looking for response, they're looking for reaction. But also they are afraid of retaliation. Um, I don't know. Ashley, let me ask you, what do you make of some of this, and how would you recommend people try to overcome these issues, such as, I don't know, fear of inaction? How would the compliance
Mhm.
department talk about that with other business leaders to say, well, here's why they're not reporting, here's why they're afraid. What should a company try to do to overcome that? You know, Ashley, what would you think? And then Bill, what would you think?
Yeah, I think some of this comes from, the different environments that our folks work in. We're looking at this globally, right? So some of this comes down to understanding the challenges that our staff face, as you mentioned, Matt. Our fundraisers may face power dynamics that make it tough to speak up. Our field staff, maybe they're just not as aware of our code or other resources. And certainly there are cultural challenges that staff face as well. I think once we know what staff are up against, we can start removing those barriers. And as Bill and Penny have both mentioned, building relationships, raising awareness, and standing in the gap to help create that trust. One of the things that I do, we have engagement surveys where we actually have these questions around retaliation. Will something happen if I speak up? I work with HR partners, I work with legal partners, and I work with local leaders to talk about that. And it's a partnership. It's never meant to be punitive. It's us working together to figure it out together. Often they do have an inkling about what might be behind some of that fear. And certainly we want to assess that with reporters on retaliation as well. But what's really interesting that I've noticed over the past several years of partnering with those HR and legal and local leaders is that now when those reports come back, they are taking action. So before I even have a chance to reach out to them, they're letting me know, hey, this score dipped a little bit, or we want to work on this. Could you come talk to our leaders about hearing concerns? Could you do a refresher for our team or a Q&A on the reporting process here? And what I realized from that is I'm no longer carrying all of this on my own. This isn't my message to own. This is them owning it. This is HR, local leaders, legal, everyone is showing real value and importance around Speak Up. And I think that helps people around the globe to trust it more when they're seeing, their local leader or their attorney leading conversations or activities around improving Speak Up.
Bill, what would you say, including maybe some practical advice on questions like should the compliance team or the internal reporting team, should they communicate with the whistleblower, even if it's anonymous, just give them a reply back? We've heard you were investigating. 3 weeks later, you say, here's an update, which we're still on it, but we can't tell you. But try to keep them involved and assuage their fears. What are some of the thoughts you have there?
So always communicate with the reporters and the whistleblowers. Number one, anonymous or non-anonymized, you always report and have a conversation as best you can. And there's lots of tools that allow you to do that, even though reports come in anonymously through helplines and hotlines for companies. You still have the ability to be able to communicate discreetly back to the reporters who are coming in and having conversations if they're not comfortable to do it, non-anonymized. I think I believe in, and I'm going to use radical because I know radical compliance, Matt, but I'm going to use radical transparency and accountability. I really believe that we have pushed the boundaries here inside the company of what we present and we push out. We share a Speak Up report every year that covers often not only the process in great detail, and that means days to close for investigations, what to expect through the entire process. We have speak up help pages where it talks about all the different avenues. But that's normal, and that's the block and tackle components. But I think we also have like really detailed analysis of the way investigations are handled. Who's a need to know party? How wide is this, knowledge base of when you raise an issue? But even beyond that, we're now starting to offer anonymized cases, investigations, situations, lessons learned, and we're publishing these on a quarterly basis in something we call Integrity Insights. And often we talk about what I call the honest truth. That's a section inside our publication, and where we literally talk about the issues that we face inside the company. And I think it's certainly a very interesting read if you're not in this industry, and certainly a very interesting read if you're an employee, because they don't realize, some of the employees don't have any idea of some of the challenges that other employees may be doing or facing in the company. And so this really provides a great talking points for us to be able to have real conversations with people about why we spend so much time and effort in certain areas. And we use those as ways to kind of get that message out and talk about what we're doing. And because that's the next piece, because if you take it all in and you don't actually share what you're doing with it, then everyone just assumes you've done nothing. But we try to get ahead of those conversations as well by providing them guidance that, look, there are certain things in this profession that we are not going to be able to share. There's details, there's privacy issues, there's employee labor law issues, but we are going to provide as much as possible because we think it's important that everyone understands that we are not resting on this. We're not just accepting these things, but we're actually actioning everything that comes through. And I think that goes back to my initial conversations with the employees, is that they need to know and trust that what you say is what you're doing. And I think that comes down to credibility and consistency in approach. And so you can't wake up one day thinking you're going to, change everything. You have to be very consistent with the way you approach employees, with the way you approach issues that your company faces. And I think over that time, people kind of understand the goodwill, the good approach, and they understand that their concerns will be taken seriously and effectively dealt with, even if they don't have the full picture and context of what that means. And that's a tough conversation we have, but we have it up front. We don't wait till they're in that spot where they want to know what happened, and we were unable to provide that level of detail that makes them feel comfortable. We have those conversations early on, and we remind everyone this is kind of the process, and here are the challenges and the restrictions. But I think radical transparency, wherever you can, you provide as much detail, as much, internal conversations around this. And I think it's been helpful for us.
Penny, let me put a question to you from the audience that we just received. What are the panel's suggestions for practically combating the lack of trust in the reporting or the investigation process? Give us some thoughts there about how to explain to employees, how to demonstrate to them that, yes, this is something we take seriously, but they have a lot of very cynical attitudes about large companies sometimes. And, how do you recommend to attendees that, what could they do to overcome that?
Well, thanks for that, Matt. I think that the person who asked the question probably feels that Bill has just answered that perfectly. But the point that I'd like to start from is the one that says that this objective of creating a speak-up culture is too important for us to be doing without a strong evidence-based approach. And so for me, as a person who brings behavioral science evidence to my recommendations, what's important to understand is that people's fear of speaking up is disproportionately large in comparison to the environment you create in the business. There will be many of you on this call who say that people being scared of speaking up here is just crazy. And I think our starting point really needs to be to say that from a behavioral science point of view, the whole idea of speaking up is absolutely terrifying for most people. And this includes for people who you might describe as an extrovert or outgoing. And that is because all of us, wherever we are, whatever jurisdiction, we all have a brain. And we now know from neuroscience, the latest studies, that one of the greatest fears that manifests in the brain during fMRI studies is a fear of isolation. This is a very primitive, fundamental fear. People feel extremely anxious when they are risking being part of the outgroup or risking the wrath of someone in a position of superiority. Then if we look from a cognitive point of view, we certainly see that we all have this bias that is inculcated into us to go with the flow, to be obedient. And it turns out that social anthropologists are helping us understand that this, again, is a very fundamental fear that exists, or should I say a drive to be part of the in-group and not take a separate stand, is a cross-cultural driver that in 99% of cultures, countries, continents, race, religion, we are inculcated with the belief that we must obey the superior, that we must fit in because there is safety in numbers. And these are the kind of fears, this is the severity, the intensity of the fear that you are up against as a compliance professional trying to create a speak-up culture. What I'm saying is, let us not underestimate what a big challenge it is. And let us understand that it is way beyond the reality in the business. And we need in our programs to touch and conquer hurdles that were in people's minds long before they came to us.
You know, I really love how you were talking about the fear of isolation is such a deep and driving force in the human brain, which I think is absolutely true. It does remind me of something else I had heard. You know, we were talking so much about speak up. We should remember that in almost all organizations, employees love to speak sideways, literally sideways. They will turn to the coworker next to them. Can you believe what this vice president is doing with the summer interns, or what that sales executive is doing to commit? Happens all the time. And what they are trying to do is forge connections so they are not isolated. They know I'm not the only crazy one, right? We're all seeing this. That is exactly what they are trying to do.
Go ahead. We try to normalize, by the way, I mean, I think that's one thing we tried to do is normalize the speak up part. So it doesn't feel so unique that, like, when you're in that situation, you raise your hand, you better see a bunch of people behind you raising their hand as well. And so we are trying to normalize this kind of speak up culture, if that makes sense. We're not trying to make this something so unique that the one time in your career you might be challenged with something that you need to raise your hand for. We're actually trying to create an environment where it's more normal to raise your hand versus not raise your hand. And I think that's all of our messaging and marketing and conversations are, to your point, Matt, you're probably not the only one that feels this way. And from my own personal experience, I can guarantee you're not the only one that feels this way. We may receive multiple inquiries coming in all about the same thing. And so you should feel more comfortable that you're not by yourself. And I think that's the message we constantly are talking about, is normalizing this notion of a speak up, because I think once people understand that, like, that's norm and that's the expectation of the company for you to hold people, each other accountable, that's probably the top pinnacle part of a speak up culture. And that, you know, you talked about block and tackle on some of these awareness of channels and how, you know, a little bit of surprise. Well, the truth is, in the tech space, we have a lot of turnover, and you are constantly re-engaging new employees, new folks. And so that's why also, just on the other side, is that this message and consistency is just, you almost have to over communicate, because every time you think you've done it, there's a whole new swarm of folks coming in that you have to re-communicate to and reset. And so that's what makes this fun, because you get a chance to keep doing it over and over and perfecting the message. I think that's the goal, is to perfect that message.
So I am going to move on to a second polling question we had. We had two for the hour here. Let's see. What is this saying? Which of the following strategies or initiatives do you think are most effective in creating a speak up culture where people feel safe to report? Anonymous reporting channels, regular ethics training and communication, recognition and reward for ethical behavior, ethics champions or ambassadors within the organization. I've seen that a lot. Publishing aggregate case details, and then coordinating with HR and other departments. So if everybody listening wants to submit their answers there, we'll get to that in a moment. I did want to ask another question, one that probably challenges global organizations a lot. So Ashley, I'll ask you this first, and then Bill, and then Penny. But how difficult is it to communicate all this across multiple cultures? Because Europe does have a very different attitude to speaking up than the United States, and perhaps in other parts of the world as well. And you're trying to get a baseline standard worldwide across many different cultures. How difficult is that? What would you say?
We are really fortunate because we have a global compliance team that reflects our organization's global work. So I have peers in Kenya, Brazil, Mongolia, and they understand the needs and the concerns of the local staff. And many of those compliance folks actually came out of the business unit. I think Bill mentioned this earlier. So they came with a passion for the work, with an understanding of the business process, the barriers, and that helps. So they're coming into that ethics and compliance field with that knowledge. And they also come from the same towns. They speak the same languages. They understand the cultures within their regions. And when we remove those barriers, when a reporter can speak with someone who feels familiar, who understands their local challenges and local customs, there's a lot less that gets lost in translation. So certainly not everybody is able to have a compliance team member globally. And even for us, we're not in every country where we work. So we also do a lot of work, place a great deal of emphasis on our partnership with local leaders. And we do our best to ensure that they are aware, that they are empowered, that they are competent and confident and resourced to set the tone for those local teams.
Bill, what would you say?
I think, as I kind of previously mentioned, I think translating HQ messaging into the field is always a challenge. There's always a global mission and a global approach on the way we're doing this, but I think trying to translate it to some of these unique scenarios and unique countries and languages always make it a challenge, one that we're up for, quite frankly, because we've got the same situation on the establishment. We have regional compliance officers, which I believe are fundamental in our program. And I might feel near and dear to that because I was one of those originally in my career in Europe. And I thought being closer to the region, being closer to the regional leadership really has set the tone and in expectation inside the regions, or the theaters here, as we call them at Juniper. You are more responsive. You are a known quantity. You are in the same time zones often, which makes a big deal. There is just this increased level of confidence and trust as you are dealing with issues at hand. There are challenges being a regional person, being too close some days to the leadership, maybe being too close to the situations. But those are all things we can undertake early on and have conversations about those and how to handle those. But I also think the other thing is that the more you can keep it closer, and I think there's something as standing in the gap. As I think Ashley, I think you said, but it was the closer you can get to the issues and the employees in terms of proximity, physical, cultural, is really meaningful. And I know compliance organizations can't have hundreds and thousands of compliance professionals in these orgs and mostly understaffed and always striving for extra headcount. Fully appreciate that, and I can see everyone nodding, even though they're not on camera. But I do believe that we've got to really keep pushing the messaging down and out. I think that resonates better. We have integrity influencers here at Juniper, which are always in the field, always the management in the field. They are local, and we will keep adding more and more to this organization over time, partly because I think we're actually seeing the real results is that we are seeing people be more comfortable and having better conversations and more quality conversations.
Penny, any other thoughts to add here about the the challenges with cultural differences and how you can overcome them. I'm really struck. Ashley and Bill are both basically saying, A, it's local people, middle managers, and B, how to make sure they are seen as trustworthy. We have been talking about middle management and trust for the last 50 minutes, and yet again comes up. But Penny, what would you say? I think you're on mute, Penny.
Human beings share an enormous number of common characteristics, but the localization is essential. So the fundamentals of your program may not be different, but the example that my colleagues here know took me aback was that in one of my video-based e-learning programs where we have the goal of ensuring that people in developing countries can locate themselves in the compliance content. I sent an ethics program to a colleague in Zimbabwe, and he wrote back and said, I love the program. I just didn't understand the evil omen in the last episode. And I said, what evil omen was that? And he said, the owl. And I said, oh, I associate the owl with wisdom. And he said, no, an owl is an evil omen. And so this is why what Bill and Ashley are talking about is so important. One needs that local context so that one doesn't spend a lot of money sending out content icons that actually dissuade people. But what I'd like to say, and this might be very hard to understand in a highly resourced organizational world, and that is however fairly you pay your employees, if they are working in an environment where there is, for example, in my country, 35% unemployment, it is quite common for a person to have 10 extended family members completely dependent on them, for us to have young first-time graduates being expected to educate their younger siblings to a high standard, expected to arrive home in a fancy car, to demonstrate and give credibility and status to the family. When you are facing the prospect of speaking up, which you know is right, no question, all of the people I'm talking about that I work with know and believe in speaking up. When they're faced with the situation, the reality is this. Is this job just about me? Or is it about the broader family that I support? Mm-hmm. And if I leave this position, what is the prospect of alternative employment? So what I need you to know is that it's not the people, for example, in Africa are not speaking up. We have hotlines here in Africa that are taking calls 24/7 from people from all over Africa, making reports of wrongdoing. What is necessary is that we understand that we have to raise and ramp up our awareness programs. They can be following the same principles that we follow anywhere in the world. Somehow I find that people say things like, oh, well, they're never going to speak up, and so they don't put effort into it. There's huge data to be got. I live in a continent with people who are very socially minded, and what you need to do is to help them understand that the group that is important, that they need to be loyal to, is the organization. It's the organization that is making it possible for them to support those 10 or 15 other people. And that means they must take the risk of alienating themselves from their smaller group community.
So in the interest of time, I wanted to move on to one or two questions that the audience have submitted. We have about 5 or 6 more minutes here. One person had asked, if I want to audit or test the effectiveness of my Speak Up program, what would you recommend? And maybe I'll ask Bill and Ashley that, but I would draw a distinction between metrics that show you're busy, because all compliance programs are busy, but that's not the same as is your program actually working effectively. But what are some of the metrics that you would be thinking about? Bill first, and then Ashley, and then Penny.
So I think, one of the things we do as a tent pole for the program is an annual integrity survey.
Mhm.
And I think part of that survey covers a lot of topics. It's actually quite detailed. It's like 50 plus questions. And I know survey fatigue, I hear, but we think it's so important. And we have such a great participation in this every year. And we talk about comfort in speaking up and in organizational justice. Are people being treated fairly, depending on their roles and responsibilities and accountability and fairness? So we look at those scores and we trend them. We've been doing this for years now. So we can see upticks and downticks and trends and areas, and we can slice and dice data left and right as anyone will in this organization in order to find the hot spots where you need to invest more time in. So that's one component. And then I think the other piece for me is metrics that it's paid more attention to it when I'm talking to like audit committees or boards, is around investigation, the reporting, not just the reporting rates, but how are they reporting? So we actually at Juniper spend a lot of time with building out all of the brands and integrity and compliance group. And we're seeing a tremendous amount of the reports actually non-anonymized coming in directly into the integrity and compliance group. And I call that a win in most days. And I think most people would. We look at that anonymized reporting rate. So it's not just enough to, how many reports are coming in, but I want to know if they're coming in, anonymized or non-anonymized. And I think we start seeing measurements of non-anonymized really being high for the company. And that, for me, signals that people are comfortable with the conversations to have these direct dialogues with the organizations, the gatekeepers of the organization.
And Ashley, what are some of the numbers that you try to look at or think about?
There are several things that we look at, and I just want to plug, Bill, you mentioned folks calling in without being anonymous. One of the things that our team really values is when people start reaching out to us directly. So they're kind of bypassing that hotline, helpline, because they've connected to a person in a relationship. So we have 3 ways that we, measure, but I don't want to underplay the value of the qualitative measurement which is, observation and relationship. So when people are reaching out directly, the things that we see when we're out in the field or when we're meeting with people, I think that's really powerful. The primary places that we look for the actual numbers and the data, we have an annual ethics training that everyone takes, and we've included a survey at the end of that training. And because everybody takes that ethics training every year, what we find is that we have great numbers for participation on that, even better than the all staff employment survey that goes out every year. So we've gotten more and more strategic on how we review and learn from that annual survey. Of course, we have helpline trends. We look at that quarterly, and we look at it annually, and often in partnership with legal, HR, and leadership. And as Bill mentioned earlier, we do an annual report out. So staff can see those trends, and we look at a big picture of what's happening. And a lot of interest in that. It's one of the biggest attended events of the year across the organization. And with this, the collaborative approach, we can sometimes be a bit predictive with the data and determine key risk areas for the coming year. So those trends, and then of course, the engagement survey, which I talked about earlier, that we partner on. And all of this, we're looking at what's happened, but also what can we predict? What are we needing to focus on for the year ahead?
Okay. And Penny, I don't know if you have any other quick suggestions. We have maybe about 30 or 45 seconds here, but any other good key metrics that you would recommend people think about?
Perfectly answered by Bill and Ashley. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Well, in that case, we are pretty much at the top of the hour and at the end, so we'll have to wrap it up here. But this has been a great discussion. So Bill Burtis, Ashley Dubrini, Peggy Milner-Smith, thank you both, or thank you all 3 very much for everything you've shared. You gave us a lot to think about, a lot of really good advice. And so thank you also to everybody else who's been listening to us. We hope that you have learned a lot. And other than that, I think that ends this webinar today. But it has been a great discussion. I really appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you. And thanks, Matt, for moderating such a great conversation.
All right. Well, in that case, everybody who's listening, thank you all for joining us, and have a good day.